Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Many online atheists label theistic arguments as God of the gaps. But what exactly does this mean, and how can theists avoid this kind of fallacious reasoning? That's the topic of this interview, and I'm joined by an expert on this topic. He's published an essay on this topic in the Blackwell Companion to Science and Christianity. My guest is Dr. Greg Ganssle. Thank you so much for joining me, Greg.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Jordan.
So I've put the link to the book in the description of the video if you want to go and check out more of the contents of the book, but this essay can be found there. And I've been meaning to do an interview on the God of the Gaps type objection for a while. And once I read your paper, I thought this lays out the problem very clearly and lays out ways that the theist can avoid this worry. So I thought we need to get Greg on and talk about this. Okay, let me just first ask you this. How did you get interested in writing an essay on God of the Gaps?
Well, it was funny. I was trying to think up a paper to give at a conference, the Evangelical Philosophical Society conference. And it just kind of occurred to me, I should think about God of the Gaps arguments. I haven't read anything about them in the literature. And so I just kind of started putting thoughts down on paper. And then I did a literature search and found that almost nothing had been published. I found one paper that I build on quite a bit in my essay by Bob Larmer, called What is Wrong with God of the Gaps Reasoning? And that was published in the International Journal for the Philosophy of Religion. And he does some really good analysis. And then I build on what he's done and put some tweaks in it. And then when I gave this paper at the conference, I had never met Bob, but he was there. He was in the audience, so I was glad I was nice to him. And we've gotten to know each other since then. He does very good work. In fact, I just edited a book on divine causation, and he has a paper in that book as well. And so it was kind of a whim, because like you said in your introduction, we hear this phrase a lot. And I thought, I wonder if anyone's done any thinking about what that actually means. But very little has been published in academic journals about it. In fact, I could find almost nothing besides Bob's paper.
Well, I'm glad you wrote it, and we're going to unpack the contents in this interview. So there are going to be a lot of arguments in this interview, and I thought it would be helpful to have slides that clearly show them. So yeah. I think we should start out this way. What's the general form of a theistic argument that will get labeled by online atheists as God of the Gaps?
Well, before you put up my reconstruction of it, I think people think the argument goes something like this. We can't explain event E, let's say. We can't explain event E with natural causes, therefore God must have done it. Or something like this. We haven't proven that it's a natural explanation, therefore it's supernatural. And so it's kind of advertised as an argument from ignorance. And I think what Larmer did in his paper, and what I build upon, is to show that really the structure is not an argument from ignorance. And you can see that as we unpack the argument. So you could go to your first slide probably at this point.
Yeah, so this will be the general form, and we're going to
Mhm.
build on this throughout the interview.
Yeah.
Let's start with that first premise. I'll read it out and
Okay, you
you can
read it because
unpack
you're a better reader than me.
it. So premise one of this general form of a theistic argument that will get labeled as God of the gaps will go something like this. It is probably the case that natural means cannot explain event E. And then 2 would be there is an explanation of event E. 3, every explanation is either natural or supernatural. And then 4, therefore, it is probably the case that there is a supernatural explanation of event E. So
Yeah,
that's the general form.
that's the general form. Yes. Now, I made this general form much more precise than most people think of it because they usually drop premise 2 and 3 out because they're kind of assumed. And you can see it's probably the case there's no natural explanation. Therefore, it's probably a supernatural.
Mhm.
And what the question I ask is, why is this considered an argument against from gaps? Why is it a gap kind of argument? So
Right. That's what I was going to ask next is where is the gap in that argument?
it really has to do with premise number one. Um, how do we conclude that it's probably the case that natural means cannot explain a certain event? And we have to search out all of the natural means that we have access to, and if none of them are adequate, then we conclude that probably there aren't any that are adequate. Of course, maybe there are natural means we don't know of, but it's right there where there's kind of a gap because it's a gap in our ability to explain something naturally. And so the accusation is that we, in some kind of fallacious way, plug in a supernatural action. Now you notice that the argument is valid, right? So the problem is not with the form or the structure of the argument, but it's really focusing on how do we justify the first premise.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we
And
do that is we do something like this. We'll say, well, oh, you've got a sub argument. Good. No natural means we know of can explain event E, and then therefore probably no natural means can explain event E. And that's how we justify premise one in these kinds of arguments. Um, if we've done a good job searching out natural means, it's not an unreasonable inference from 1A to 1B.
yes. Now, 1A to 1B, there's a hidden premise there. So why don't we go ahead and mention this? The strength of that inference depends on a conditional premise that's not currently on the slide.
Right.
So let's look at that conditional inference now. You can read that if you'd like.
Okay. If there was a natural explanation or a natural means to explain event E, we would probably know that this is the case. And this strategy to analyze the arguments, like I said, it was developed first by Bob Larmer. And what it does is it changes the argument, or at least it reveals that the argument structure is not an argument from gaps in our knowledge. It's actually a conditional argument. It's not about things we don't know, but it's about things we do know. If there was a natural means, we would probably know that this is the case. So his example, which I cite and I quote in my article, is he says, if my son comes in to me and says, there's a greyhound dog in the bathroom, and I go look and I see no evidence of a greyhound dog, I can conclude there's no greyhound because the sentence, if there were a greyhound dog in the bathroom, I would probably know it, is true. And so a lot rests on the truth or falsity of the conditional.
Yes. So I thought this was helpful too. We're going to look more at that conditional in a
Mhm.
moment, but I thought this was helpful. I think Richard Dawkins uses this language that the reason, if there is a gap here in terms of our justification of premise one, that's where the gap is allegedly supposed to be, how you would justify premise one of the argument. And then we gave this little sub argument in green here. But I think someone like Richard Dawkins says the problem is supposed to be that if you identify a gap and say, well, there's a supernatural explanation, since we don't know of a natural explanation, then you're locating God on like shrinking ground,
Yeah.
because in science, we're constantly making progress and gaps are getting plugged in. And so there's supposed to be this worry that what's left for God to explain, or what's left, what little room is left for supernatural explanations, is shrinking. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And it is Dawkins uses this in his book, The God Delusion. I'm sure others have talked about this as well. There's a widespread view that the progress of science is explaining more and more in such a way that there's less and less room for supernatural explanation. I think that's an important point. However, it works really well for 19th century science. But most of the major scientific advances in the 20th century have gone in the opposite direction, to be honest. Like the discovery of the redshift, which led to the theorizing about the Big Bang. The fact that the universe has a beginning opens doors for theistic explanations. Even the discovery of the DNA code, which many people think is an information carrying device, so to speak, opens the door for an intelligent cause. And so the things that seemed to be blocking supernatural explanations out as science progressed really many of them began to be overturned, or new scientific discoveries began to open that door, even relatively early in the 20th century. And it continues to this day. So the claim that the gaps are shrinking relies on a couple of really well-known examples, the rise of Darwinism. But overall, it's not clear that the progress of science is leaving less room for things that may point to a supernatural explanation. The other one I didn't mention here is the fine tuning of the universe. The very small probability that by chance the conditions could be right for a life permitting universe. All of these pretty recent discoveries are pointing in the opposite direction. So the claim that the gaps are shrinking, in one sense, is not always accurate. We really can give a pushback on that. But of course, the argument we're discussing is not really about gaps anyway. And that's some of the point of thinking hard about how these arguments go.
Yeah. So let's think about this now. How might advances in science now prevent this type of argument from being successful?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that I mentioned in my paper, and I think this is really important, because we have to admit that we might have a particular argument where it is true that it's probably the case that natural means can't explain. And therefore, we have grounds for thinking a supernatural explanation is warranted. But the progress of science could overturn arguments like this. One way it could do it is this. The progress of science could discover entirely new kinds of naturalistic explanations that are relevant to the particular argument. And of course, then premise one would not be true in the general form of the argument. So if we discover new natural means, that might be an issue that overturns the argument. The other way the progress of scientific investigation can overturn a particular argument is that it might unearth facts that we didn't know of that show that one of the natural explanations we considered but thought was explanatorily vacuous in this context turns out to be explanatorily fruitful. So we could discover new connections between naturalistic explanations. And of course, we want to be absolutely open to this because the progress of science is a great thing and we celebrate it. Now, what happens if this occurs? Well, what it does is it shows that whatever the argument is, the particular argument, it's not a very good argument. But that's not a big problem. That's not a problem with the form of the argument, because this can happen with any argument that relies on empirical information for its premises. And it could be arguments in history or in sociology or in psychology, as well as arguments that are relevant to the hard sciences. Any argument that trades on empirical understanding is open to revision because our empirical information is always being increased or adjusted or fine-tuned, so to speak. So it's not a problem with the form of the argument. We just might learn, oh, here's an argument that was pretty strong. And it was a perfectly good argument given what we knew. But now we know it's not so good. I think an example of this is some of the old-fashioned design arguments put forward by people like Paley, because he appealed to the complex structure of biological organisms. Well, the Darwinian story provides a pretty decent explanation for that. And he didn't know anything about Darwin, so it didn't mean his argument was bad. We just discovered more things to show that the very thing that we thought could not be explained very well naturalistically possibly can be explained naturalistically. Well, then we drop the design argument in Paley's kind of framework. Now, people working in intelligent design are identifying specific things in biology, not just complex structures, but things like information in the genetic coding and things like this that they still think are immune from the Darwinian objection. And those arguments might be fruitful. And we have to consider them on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how might the critic try to show that all of these sorts of theistic arguments, we just gave the general form,
right?
But any argument that's saying we're trying to find this explanation for event E, that sort of thing, how might the critic try to show that all such theistic arguments will eventually be overturned by advances in science?
Well, there are a couple of ways. I mean, people, good thinking people have that kind of conviction often. And sometimes it's a matter of a prior commitment to metaphysical naturalism. And so the person just believes in naturalism, there are no supernatural entities. Now, if you believe that, then you are going to have confidence that the progress of science will probably overturn all of these arguments. And I make a note in my paper that there's really nothing wrong with a commitment to naturalism in this context, but you want to identify that it's your commitment to naturalism, which is a philosophical position, that drives your rejection of all supernatural type arguments. Other ways that people could do it is they could have kind of an inductive generalization, and this relates to what Dawkins is saying about shrinking ground. Look, these arguments seem to be becoming overturned, and so probably they're all going to be overturned, or something along those lines. I don't think that's very fruitful, like I said, because the progress of science can go in either direction, as we've seen in the 20th century, and can open up ground for supernatural explanation, as well as closing ground for that. So there are some ways that the critic can kind of bolster the conviction that all of these things will be, all of these kinds of arguments will be overturned. Probably the most reasonable posture is to take the arguments on a case-by-case basis and see how they fare.
Yeah, so you answered you anticipated a couple of my questions. So
okay,
I think
good.
the most promising, no, that's good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
It seems like the most promising way that the naturalist might try to argue that all of these sorts of theistic arguments will eventually be overturned by advances in science it seems to me like the best route to go is that inductive generalization route. So give some historical examples,
Right.
and say this, that gives some inductive evidence that such an argument will be overturned. But you point out, I guess you give two responses to that. You might say, advances in science go in either direction.
Yeah.
So that might undermine the strength of that inductive inference.
Yeah.
And then the second was there may be, I don't know if it, I wasn't clear on this point in your paper. You mentioned there might be a concealed a priori commitment to naturalism.
Right.
But I'm not sure how that's connecting with the inductive generalization.
Well, it might be a different sort of reason. It might be more of a motivation why that inductive generalization is plausible to the objector, right? Because if the objector is pretty convinced that naturalism is the case, and that might be a result of thinking that certain arguments against the existence of God are very strong, then the objector is going to have very low sense of likelihood that these arguments are going to be strong, and that can be some of the motivation for thinking, well, eventually all the gaps will shrink and all of these arguments will be overturned.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I thought this was a really interesting point that you made in the paper. The strength of that argument, I'll put it back on the screen. The strength of the argument in this form doesn't depend solely on empirical premises. The argument can be strengthened by facts about divine agency, you say. So
Yeah.
Can you explain how this argument can be strengthened by facts about divine agency?
Yeah. Notice the way we have it now. It's the juice, so to speak, of the argument comes entirely from the unavailability of a natural explanation. And I fully think we can have strong arguments that way. Of course, it depends on the particularities of the argument. But there's another consideration, and this has to do with if God is real and is active in the world, what would we expect to see as a result of that? And so to add those considerations into the argument, we go into not just it's the low probability of a natural explanation, but it's also the high probability that an event E would occur if God is real. So you might look at the existence of a universe, right? It's not just that it's a low probability of naturalistic explanation, but that's kind of what we would expect if God is real, because God is the kind of being that has the capacities to bring a universe into being. And God has the moral qualities that make us expect that he's going to want to be in relationship with other beings. And so if God is real, then we expect event E. It's not just we can't explain event E. And so I think you can strengthen the argument by, in a sense, going from both directions there.
Yeah. So I think you call that in the paper 1D.
Do I? Good.
Right. So, and this actually leads to two different versions you can make of this argument. I guess in my mind, I'll go to full screen real quick. I'm kind of thinking we'll get to this. We'll unpack the two versions more in just a moment. But one route is to think, well, every explanation is either natural or supernatural.
Right.
So if I know that the natural explanations occupy like a small chunk of the probability space, then automatically I know the majority, what's more probable is the supernatural explanation.
Right.
That's one direction you can go. The other direction is to say, no, I actually have independent reasons to think that this event is what I would see if a supernatural agent or divine agent was involved.
Yeah.
So then you're not just depending on the small probability of the natural explanation. You're actually showing it is. I have independent reason to think the supernatural explanation is probable.
Yeah, let me make a comment on that. I think that's a really good insight. It's probably hard to put forward a plausible story about the probability space of natural versus supernatural explanations without more information. And so that's why I think thinking about divine agency is what's really fruitful here. So,
okay, let's we're actually making good time here. So, yeah, you say, hold on, let me see. I lost track of my question here. Yeah. What reasons could be given in support of that conditional 1D, the one that says if there is a divine agent, we would expect event E?
Well, the reasons are going to be in terms of things like this. Given what we know about the divine agent, the alleged divine agent, right? We're still not sure God exists here. What kinds of purposes are either expected given the character of the divine being, or at least fit very closely with that character? And of course, agents, if God is an agent, which every concept of God says he is, every monotheistic concept of God, then God acts for reasons. And we can start thinking, okay, what might God do given the reasons that are available to us in our concept of God? And so most philosophers and most philosophy of religion is done with a pretty minimalistic picture of who God is. God is unlimited in power, unlimited in knowledge, wholly good. And if there's a universe, God is the creator of the universe. And that's kind of the minimalistic definition. But that is enough to get some of these arguments off the ground, because God's being wholly good is a moral dimension. And so we know that God's purposes are good. So, for example, the fact that we live in a world with objective moral obligations is something we would expect if there's a divine agent of this kind. And so it's not just that it's hard to explain objective moral obligations naturalistically. It's the very thing we would expect if the divine agent was active and creating the world for his own reasons. So, I mean, there's plenty more there we can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, you can keep expanding on that. I'll mention this. So I've made some videos, animated videos that summarize Richard Swinburne's arguments, and
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the general sort of structure that Swinburne gives is he provides reasons to think that there can be no natural explanation of some
Mm-hmm.
phenomenon, or at least if there is, maybe it's really unlikely, something like. But many times he says there just can't be. It's the sort of
Right.
thing that there can't even be a natural explanation.
Mm-hmm.
But then he says, but you would expect this phenomenon if there was a God of the sort that he describes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I see that being pretty similar to the argument that you're summarizing here
Mm-hmm.
in structure.
Very much so, right? And I think, well, obviously, I think Swinburne's right about this. It's not just about a limit, because there's no natural explanation or it's unlikely there's a natural explanation, but it's also the likelihood of the supernatural agent acting in this way, and it's actually that aspect I think is provides stronger arguments for many of the phenomena we're wind up talking about.
Okay, so this brings me to my final question for you, and we are going to have Q&A. So if you have a question that you want to ask Dr. Ganssle, then just put it in the chat right now. Please put the word question at the beginning. I've already seen some in the chat, so we'll be able to pull those up in a moment. So I want to try and put all this together. It seems like you can actually generate two final argument forms that you say are immune to the shrinking gap objection, like what Dawkins has in mind. So let me put these on the screen now.
Okay.
The first form we can read through. Yeah, why don't you read through those?
Okay. No natural means we know of can explain event E. There is an explanation of event E. Every explanation is either natural or supernatural. If there were a natural means to explain event E, we would probably know that this is the case. Therefore, probably no natural means can explain event E. Therefore, it's probably the case there's a supernatural explanation of event E. So this is in taking our argument form that we've talked about and putting within the argument kind of the grounds for what is now premise 4. Because we don't know of any explanation, natural explanation, probably there isn't one. Okay, so that's the reasoning that supports 4. And of course, we have to hold that with some degree of humility, because we know that there could be explanations, as we discussed, that emerge with further investigation. So that's argument type 1. And do you want to go to 2?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and go to 2. And
Right.
I have a comment, something you said at the end of the paper that I thought would be helpful here.
Okay. So 2, I have different numbers here to keep them apart. No natural means we know of can explain E. There is an explanation of E. Every explanation is either natural or supernatural. If there were a natural means to explain E, we'd probably know that this is the case. Therefore, probably no natural means can explain event E. Thus far, we're following the first argument form exactly. And now we are putting in the second conditional. If there were a supernatural agent at work in this context, we would expect something like event E. Therefore, it is probably the case that there's a supernatural explanation of event E. And so in this argument, the final argument type 2, you can see that the conclusion is based not just on the low likelihood that a natural explanation can explain the event, but also on the high expectation that this is something we would observe if the supernatural agent is at work. And thus, I think this kind of argument is going to be stronger. And it's kind of a recommendation to theists who are arguing to try to move past just the failure of natural explanations and employ more, or in addition, the expectations that our concept of God provide for us for these kinds of events.
All right. So you say something really interesting about this second type of argument at the end of the paper. So somebody like Michael Behe tries to argue that the bacterial flagellum is evidence of intelligent design.
Right.
But take other theists. Michael Behe is a theist. Take other theists, somebody like Swinburne. Swinburne doesn't appeal to a bacterial flagellum. Instead, Swinburne appeals to things like the fact that we would be embodied and we would be conscious, and that the laws would be simple or intelligible, and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And something I thought that was helpful that you pointed out at the end of the paper, you say, looking at a premise like premise 12 here, it's not clear to me that a supernatural agent is all that interested in the bacterial flagellum. So if you plug in for event E, you talk, like the arrival of the bacterial flagellum or something like that.
The irreducible complexity, or whatever Behe's phrase is. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like, I can't think of really strong arguments why the supernatural agent would be, why we would expect something like the bacterial flagellum on if there were a supernatural agent.
Right.
But it seems much clearer to me, at least, some of the reasons that a supernatural agent would have for creating conscious beings, say. So I think for that reason, consciousness would be a much more a much stronger event to appeal to than something like the bacterial flagellum. That was the impression I got from what you said at the end of the paper. Am I accurately characterizing that?
Oh, absolutely. No, you got it perfectly right. I think so. I think Behe's arguments can be strong, but premise 12 of this structure for Behe's arguments is not going to be as strong. I mean, perhaps you could make an argument for the step in development that a flagellum provides for the entire development of life on Earth, or something like this, but it's going to be pretty indirect. But if you think about things like consciousness, or the origin of life at all, or another one that's interesting is language, linguistic capacities. You think a supernatural agent that has the features that our minimalistic theory of God has, it's very plausible that being would be very interested in those things. And so developing arguments around those features of reality, and we could throw in objective morality as well, I think might give you stronger arguments. So, but it's not that, I mean, I wouldn't say don't pursue arguments around biological things like the flagellum, because we want to do as much research, as many things as possible, and things can be fruitful. But we can identify things that the supernatural agent very plausibly would be interested in, and that will give us a stronger argument because it strengthens that conditional, which is marked on the screen as number 12 there.
All right, so why don't we go to Q&A and for a few minutes, and then after Q&A ends, we'll wrap up the discussion.
Sure.
So the first question I saw in the chat was from TH. Let me take, well, I think he's asking about this first slide. So TH said, why should we think that 1C is true?
Yeah,
So
this is a
1C
good.
says, if there was a natural means to explain event E, we would probably know that this is the case.
Well, of course, this is a good question. It all depends what the argument is about, right? But there are all kinds of things that we can explain with natural means, and we know that it's the case. It's no mystery that when I heat up water on the stove and it begins to boil, I'm not perplexed about a natural explanation. And so there are lots of events, everyday events, where we do know that a natural explanation is adequate to the task. If we search out a phenomenon sufficiently, we can begin to think, wow, why haven't I found a naturalistic explanation? So this is one path. And this, you might think of the origin of life in this respect. Another path is there are certain events or features of reality that really barely lend themselves to the strong kind of naturalistic explanation you get from the hard sciences. And this is things like objective moral obligations. It's pretty hard to find a naturalistic explanation for objective moral obligations. And I think we can explore what those obligations are like and come to that conclusion. Now, we're never going to get past probability here or varying degrees of likelihood. We're never going to say, well, if there's a natural means to explain it, we would know that this is the case, because we always have to be open to the being surprised by certain developments in our repertoire of possible natural explanations. But I think there are many cases where we've done our due diligence and we can conclude that this is true. Now, if we conclude it's true, it doesn't mean it can't be overthrown by more discoveries. It's just that right now we've got a pretty strong argument for something. It may turn out later it's not so strong because we learn new things. Do you want to follow up or on this?
Yeah, let me say this. In the paper with respect to 1C, you said this, if I remember correctly. It's not necessarily that you have to know that you have to know like the details of the mechanism, the naturalistic mechanism, how it explains event E.
Right.
Rather, you know that there is some natural explanation of it. You may not have the details of it worked out.
Right.
Is that right?
I think so. I mean, I think it would be putting an unfair burden on the person trying to challenge the argument for the supernatural to insist that the objector has to know what the explanation is, right? What the objector needs only is to have it be likely that there is a natural explanation. So, you know, you're a biology teacher. I'm pretty sure there's a natural explanation for how photosynthesis takes up materials, sun energy, carbon dioxide and produces oxygen. But I can't remember. I don't know what it is. And so it's not incumbent on me to know exactly what the natural explanation is. I want to give all the reasonability to the objector on this point.
A second thing to follow up with, so TH added some specific examples that might be helpful for thinking about 1C. So TH said, I'll put this on the screen. Right now, physics does not have a natural explanation for turbulence. Biologists do not have a natural explanation for the cause of ADHD. He adds, in 1950, we didn't have an explanation for how proteins were made in the cell. So think about these examples. So say it's we don't yet have a natural explanation of these things. Should we use premise 1C in defense of like an argument for, well, we don't have a natural explanation of ADHD, but if we would probably know that this is the case if there were one. Well, and so you can use this somehow for evidence for as an argument for God.
I think those are really helpful examples because I think, no, we shouldn't do that because each of those examples are examples of things that we would really expect there to be a naturalistic explanation for. And even though we don't know what it is. And when we're on the horizon of the frontiers of investigation, our confidence in 1C is going to be lower than if it's something that we've really been able to explore. So it's not always the case that 1C is going to be true. I think you would fully expect there to be a biochemical explanation for ADHD, or and in the 50s, same thing with protein synthesis in the cell. Even though the mechanism was unknown, it at that point might have been unreasonable to think, oh, it must be a supernatural explanation, because it's the kind of thing we would expect a natural explanation. Mm-hmm. At least this is my first pass at that. So I think those examples are really helpful for that reason.
Yeah. So I think it's important, to keep in mind this argument that's on the screen is a valid argument. Mm-hmm. So if the conclusion is false, then it's because one of the premises are false.
Right.
And it's not the case that this is an argument from ignorance either. Mm-hmm. Again, it would just be a premise is false. So for some events that we don't yet have a natural explanation for, premise 1C will be false, even though we do not yet have a natural explanation for that event. Premise 1C will be false for those. Mm-hmm. But for other events, premise 1C will be true.
Yeah.
And it may depend, I don't know, it may depend on the amount of work that's been done on the search for natural explanations of that. If lots and lots of work has been done on it over quite a long time by many people, mm-hmm. then you might begin to think, it's like that Greyhound case. You might think, gosh, we've got a lot of people going in the bathroom looking for this Greyhound. Yeah. If there were one, you'd think that somebody would have seen it by now. But if the research on a topic's been limited, mm-hmm. then you might think it's reasonable to still expect there to be a natural explanation of this.
Yeah. Now, the main point of my article is not that there are going to be supernatural explanations that succeed, or arguments for supernatural explanations that succeed, although I believe there are some. The main point is that arguments that are called God of the gaps aren't about gaps. It's not about ignorance, but it's about what we know. So, for example, if 1C is true, it's because what we know about the event and what we know about natural the resources for natural explanations. It's not about what we don't know. We can see that all of our resources of naturalistic explanations seem to be inadequate for this event. There's no appeal to ignorance anywhere. And so that was the main thing I was after. But in this last part where we did the 2 argument forums and we talked about divine agent, the purposes of a divine agent, that is more about how you might strengthen an argument for a supernatural explanation if you can locate it within the expectations of what a divine agent would do. Yeah, so that's very good. And those examples are really helpful because they give us clear cases where we don't know the precise explanation, but we're very confident we're going to find a natural explanation for those things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So this one, let me go back to this screen. This one comes from Vaz Kalma. Obviously impossible to say with any real confidence, but I'm interested in which family of arguments for theism Dr. Ganssle thinks will be most discussed a couple hundred years from now.
Oh.
Same ones?
Oh, that's a good question. I suspect moral arguments for theism will continue to be discussed. I think the notion that there are objective moral obligations is almost inescapable, despite people's alleged commitment to moral relativism. I actually think very few people are really moral relativists. They're moral relativists about certain things, but not completely. There are some exceptions, but I think they're rare. I think it might be that the fine-tuning argument will continue to be discussed 100 years from now. I think it is a very strong argument. I think the multiverse response runs into strange things because the multiverse, as used in that argument, the other universes are themselves not naturalistic things because they're outside of the reach of science. And I actually have a paper on that I should email to you. We could talk about it sometime. So I think those arguments might be discussed for a while. And I can't say about the other ones. I'd love to see arguments developed more rigorously from beauty. I think people could develop a strong argument for the existence of God from the experience and reality of beauty, but that's hasn't been developed so much.
All right, last question here, and then we'll wrap up. One more from TH. Doesn't the various strands of the problem of evil complicate our expectations in premise 12? Let me put premise 12 back up on the screen. If there were a supernatural agent at work in this context, we would expect something like event E.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It depends what E is, right? The problem of evil is like, maybe you want to say it this way: if there is a supernatural agent at work, we would not expect as much evil as we see. And that's kind of how you can frame the problem of evil, and in the same kind of structure here. And I actually think that's a very good way to frame the problem of evil. I think if our concept of supernatural agent is limited to this minimalistic theism, then the arguments from evil are stronger. But if you have a fuller concept of God, I mean, one with more resources. So suppose Christianity is true. And in Christianity, one of the things we get is a lot of information about the purposes of God, because he's revealed those things in the scriptures. And if Christianity is true, we would expect lots of horrible evil, because it's a story of redemption from horrible evil. And so the more information that Christianity provides to our understanding of a supernatural agent undermines the surprise you might otherwise feel at the kind of evil we see in the world. It's pretty perfectly compatible with the Christian story, the kinds of horrible evils we see. And so I know I'm moving into another area here, but when we start thinking about what should we expect when a supernatural agent is at work, this is where different concepts of God play a role, because your concept of God is what provides resources for your expectations. And in the Christian story, we have a lot more resources to shape our expectations about what we're going to see in the world. And it actually includes horrible evil. Horrible evil is not a shock to the Christian story. So I don't know if you want to follow up on that, since I kind of pushed in a new direction.
I think I'll leave it there.
Okay.
So let's wrap up. How would you like to conclude our discussion?
Well, first I want to thank you, Jordan. It was really, really good. You've got good listeners, good questions. What I was most interested in summarizing the paper is that the structure of these papers, or the structure of these arguments, are not about gaps and not about ignorance. They're about what we know about natural explanations and what we know about various kinds of events. And that was the main thing I was trying to get at. So I'll leave with that summary.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Greg. I really enjoyed the conversation. And thank you all for watching. Please check out my videos offering arguments from some of Richard Swinburne's work.
Yeah.
I think those are good places. If you're interested in this discussion, you might be interested in checking those arguments out. So thanks for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.